who, after a long discussion, they were graduate students in psychology and neuropsychology. And it was quite a lively group. And they asked some of us, how in the world is it possible to have a career in this field? Can you point us in the right direction? Can you send us to the programs? Can you give us a career path? And obviously there isn't really a career path in this field. But I was talking with one of them later in more depth, and he said, why don't you at least gather some elders in the field to tell their stories, and perhaps that'll at least give some leads and maybe some inspiration. So I did call on a handful of people who've taken different paths in this field, and I'll say at the outset that one of the people we were really hoping to have with us tonight is Deborah Illinois. And I'm sorry to say that Deborah is still struggling with some post-operative pain that is preventing her from doing very much, and certainly preventing her from carrying luggage around London. So she wasn't able to be with us. And I send her my regrets and our thoughts. So I think we haven't thought this out terribly well together, but I think we're going to just tell a bit of our personal stories, and then since there are only 4 of us, there should be plenty of time for other stories that some of you might want to tell. We have a number of people with interesting career paths in the room. So I'll start with Eberhard. Eberhard did tell me that he's already told much of his story, so he doesn't necessarily want to say a whole lot more, but I encouraged him to tell us some more.
Well, I can keep my stories quite short. The title of my presentation was I Did It My Way, auf Deutsch. But nowadays I'm not quite sure if I say this auf Deutsch, given the recent political things in Europe, in Central Europe. Nevertheless, my personal anecdote, so to say, was connected with the person of my academic teacher, and this was Professor Hans Bender, who was the founder of the Freiburg Institute for Border Areas of Psychology and Mental Hygiene, was very much influential regarding my own career pattern. So under his tutorial, I started to study psychology, and I had the rather early chance to get in contact with the whole phenomena and people reporting such phenomena, which form, for me at least, so to say, the central tenets of paranormal phenomena, of parapsychology itself. Yes. And this early career also opened me different perspectives, for example, to get in contact with quite different people who are reporting paranormal experiences. One of my first tasks was when I started as an internship at the Freiburg Institute to help Professor Hans Bender to answer a never-ending flood of letters. And this was something like a test which every newcomer at the Institute had fulfilled. Because at these times, in the early 70s, you see, there was no internet and so no electronic communication. And so the range of the letters arriving at the Institute were 8 pages of nearly you couldn't nearly read the words of somebody writing, "Help me, Herr Professor, the 3 hypnotists in the other building are vexing me every day, every night, and so on. That was the more clinical side. And on the other hand, of course, I had also the chance to go into the field by looking into poltergeist cases, and which was, as some of you will know, a quite exquisite opportunity to get to the real thing, so to say. And quite early, I got the impression that you cannot understand paranormal phenomena without having a first or a rather firm grounding, at least in a social science, and this time in psychology. And so this interpretation or this firm grounding helped me a lot to get into a better understanding regarding the dynamics of such phenomena. And of course, a second lesson for me, quite important, was that Hans Bender forced all his collaborators to give also public lectures. And this was an excellent opportunity, of course, to learn more about the expectation of people who are encountering such phenomena or reporting such their personal phenomena. And for me, so to say, in these early years, I got a very, very good understanding regarding the existential importance of such phenomena on the background of individual biographies. And taken all this together, it was quite helpful for me to prepare at least a certain deep understanding why parapsychology on the one hand is such a controversial topic, and on the other hand, that apparently the personal importance of such phenomena stay through the whole life. And the third moment, which was also quite important for my personal education or finding a career path, was the opportunity to read a lot of books relevant to the history of parapsychology. And as I told you in my invited address, my first task was to do a review about this book of Max de Zoar, Vom Jenseits der Seele, from Beyond of the Soul. And this lecture helped me, at this time I was 22, 23 years old, it helped me a lot to understand what is at stake, so to say, when we are dealing with exceptional human experiences. And this book, written by Max de Zoar, is, so to say, a quite typical product of a skeptical academic dealing with puzzling phenomena. And this became something like a model for me that you should look twice if you are experiencing such phenomena, because Max de Zoar, so to say, he was trained. My friend Gerd Höbelmann knows everything about his life. He was first trained as a philosopher, a young philosopher, then he studied medicine, and finally, so to say, he got into the field also of legerdemain. He became a magician. And all these facets of his skills, so to say, helped me quite at the beginning to get a deeper understanding and helping me doing it my way. That's for the moment.
Why don't we take a minute after each presentation to see if there are responses. They could be questions, they could be ideas that occur to you in response to what's been said. Any? Marilyn?
I was just wondering again, why did you step in Freiburg? Did you know about Hans Bender when he went there?
Well, going back to my biography, well, by the way, I should recommend you a book by Rosemary Pilkington. I suppose a lot of people here had contributed also to this book. This is Men and Women in Parapsychology. I mean, Walter has written an article, and yourself, Alan Doerr. This book is dealing with biographies of psychical researchers, and it was published, it was edited by Rosemar Pilkington, and was published 2 years ago. And this gives you a very good introduction into the profile, how people approach this topic. Coming back to your question, well, first, I studied philosophy and history at the University of Tübingen. And I remember that at the time, well, I started with 18, 19 years, and at that time I came across a certain journal called Zeitschrift für Parapsychologie und Grenzgebiete der Psychologie, which was laying in the lecture hall of the University of Tübingen. And I got interested in such things. And not only that, at that time I had also the chance to visit in Weinsberg the house of Justinus Kerner. Kerner was a famous physician and living in the 19th century, and he was also a poet and very much interested in the problems of animal magnetism and mesmerism. One of his famous books exists also in English translations, a series of Brevorst, die Serien von Brevorst. And Justinus Kerner was also interested in problems of demonic possession. And I remember after I have read, I bought a little book at this exhibition in the Weinheim house, and I read it in the bus, and I said, that could be, it's not impossible such things are happening. And so I had very much got in a protest attitude, but nevertheless, then I started to rethink, to switch my studies and to go into medicine. That was, so to say, my initial motive to get in medicine and to become a psychiatrist. And at this moment, when I came to Freiburg to study medicine, there was Hans Bender, a very popular figure among the German students, not only students, but so to say the whole population from Freiburg and from France, and came to listen to Hans Bender's public lectures. And I also attended, after I have heard his name, and this presentation it was going back to 1966, well, yes, 66. That was my first personal encounter with Hans Bender, and his name was already primed by all this lecture which I had before. And I think what we heard from Caroline Watt and from other people here, it's exceptional, it's really quite of importance if you get a good academic model, so to say, how to learn, how to study exceptional phenomena. That was a long answer.
Let me pass the mic on to Stan Krippner.
Well, thank you. What a good idea for a panel, and I hope we do this again in the future, because we have people in the audience who should be up on this table also. Half a dozen, I won't name them all, but there's Donald West, who I've admired for 50 years, ever since his book on Lords came out, and I'd like to hear his story on what led him into the field, other people. So let's do this again next year. Now, in terms of my own story, this has been written about in many of my autobiographical writings, but oddly enough, it started on the radio when I was living on a farm in the state of Wisconsin in the U.S. Midwest. We didn't have television, of course, back in those days, back in the 1940s, but I was listening to a radio show, The Amazing Dunninger, who was a mentalist. And I was fascinated by that, and when I went to the University of Wisconsin in the 1950s, I became a member of the Wisconsin Union Student Directorate, and we had the task of inviting people from different professions to give talks and presentations. And I said, what about Dunninger? And one of the people on the directorate who was an expert on show business says, well, don't you know that Dunninger's a mentalist? Everything he does is sleight of hand. Well, I had studied magic in my childhood. And I thought, yes, that clicks. So let's find somebody else. My philosophy professor, Campbell Garnett, suggested J.B. Rhine, and he told me about Rhine's work at Duke University. And so I, in my naivete, wrote J.B. Rhine without checking with the psychology department. J.B. Rhine accepted, and again, in our naivete, we asked the psychology department to co-sponsor it. And we were excoriated. They said, you will bring disgrace on the university, and so we will give you no money. So Ryan said, if you really want me so badly, get me trade fair from Chicago. I'll be addressing the American Chemical Society. So he came up for train fare only. We had a packed house in the middle of a snowstorm, and gave I've heard him lecture many times. That was one of his best lectures. And the psychology department wanted students to boycott the event, and one of the professors said, well, if you want to go and hear something about ESP, which was all horseshit, go and hear it from the biggest ass of them all. Well, he came, and not only did he come, he invited me to visit him at Duke University, and serendipitously, I had a job in Richmond, Virginia, after I graduated, and I took a train to Duke University, and not only did I sit in on his session, he and his brilliant wife, Louisa, invited me into their home. We became personal friends, and what can I say, the rest is history. And then at Northwestern University, where I went for my graduate work, I was the head of the Educational Honor Society, and we invited J.B. Rhine to give the banquet address. And this time we had money to bring him out properly. But again, the psychology department, the chair, a very important figure in psychology, did not want any of his faculty members to come, and sort of issued an edict. The one professor who broke the taboo was Donald Campbell, who gave some very intelligent questions, and who went on to become president of the American Psychological Association, a personal friend of mine. But at the same university, the psychology department invited Gardner Murphy to speak, not knowing he was interested in parapsychology, which of course I knew of. And I asked Gardner if he would be interested in meeting with a small group of us interested in parapsychology. Arthur Hastings, a classmate of mine, who some of you know, a member of them. And so he had a very delightful several-hour session, and then Arthur and I actually drove him to the train station so that he could take the train back. And we discovered that he was going to be guest professor at the University of Hawaii. Well, I was going to Hawaii because I was invited to be part of a wedding party in Honolulu. And so I ended up being his research assistant. So I became friends with Gardner and his wife Lois, who lived to be the age of 100, by the way. And so my close, and again, a guest in their home, my close involvement with both the Rhines and the Murphys, I mean, what else could I do but become interested in the field? And then Montague Ullman, who many of you know of, received a grant to set up a parapsychology laboratory at Maimonides Medical Center for the study of dreams. And of course, by this time, I was a charter member of the Parapsychological Association, and he needed a research director. Well, he was turned down by notable people, many of whom you folks know about, and I was stupid enough or willing enough to take the chance. There was only funding for 2 years. We stretched it out to 10 years. Within that 10-year period of time, and also with Chuck Anderson's help in the last couple of years, we produced 100 research papers in peer-reviewed journals, came out with a monograph and a book, and then the funding stopped, and I had a wife and 2 stepchildren to put through school, and at that point I got an offer from what is now Saybrook University. Well, in the meantime, I had continued to keep in touch with the mainstream psychology, and so there were courses that I was able to teach. I designed all of the courses in personality and in the neurosciences and in research methodology, and so I was able to fall back on something once I no longer was able to depend on parapsychology for a living. Now, I've really never had any big grants since that time, and what I've done in parapsychology has been from my own funds, more recently from a small collection of money that graduates of Saybrook University have set up for me, which is why I'm able to attend conventions like this. I never could have paid for the conventions myself, and Saybrook can't afford to send its faculty members off to conventions. So I'm thankful to my graduates for being so kind and so gracious and so good to me. Now, to bring things full circle, my interest in magic has paid off in many, many ways. On more than one occasion, I've been able to spot metal benders and know how they did their work and sort of warn the investigators. Most notably, when Peter Phillips invited me to the ill-fated Mac Lab in St. Louis, and William Browd and I came at the same time, and after visiting the so-called Alpha Boys and seeing the videotapes, both of us were convinced that this is all sleight of hand. And the rationale I've written about, William has written about that, but it really sort of put a slowdown on the interest and probably prevented them from publishing a paper which would have embarrassed them in the field. And so that's one case, one of many cases where my interest in magic actually paid off. Many, many other cases too, like the psychic in Brazil that I've investigated, and making sure that there are enough controls in place so there was a reasonable case that could be made that his apports are genuinely produced, even though we didn't have a magician on hand. Actually, many, many years later, I did get to meet the amazing Dunninger. And due to Berthold Schwartz, who some of you know, a psychiatrist who was a member of this organization, we sat in the front row during a magic show in Madison Square Garden that got nationwide publicity because it was the most elaborate sawing a woman in half that you'd ever seen. As she was sawed in half, blood and guts spewed into the audience, hitting people in the front row. Folks were fainting, medics were called, people were taken out on stretchers, and Dunninger told me how the whole thing was done. Optical illusion, of course. So, at the present time, I continue to do what I can in terms of editing, writing. Volume 10 of Advances in Parapsychological Research is almost finished. I'm also supervising a study some of my former students have done on remote viewing. The data are now being analyzed. It's a very, very stringent test of remote viewing, and we have about 20 people who have been viewed. The outstanding viewer, by the way, who's got, I think, 18 out of 20 hits, comes from the UK, even though he was viewing something in California. So, that's a very, very quick summary. Many details which maybe will come out in the question period. But as you can see, you have to have something to fall back upon if your funding for parapsychological research runs out. Not everybody is fortunate to have an endowed chair or a constant source of income, and so I keep telling my students who are interested in parapsychology, become well-grounded in something. Even, it might not be psychology, it might be medicine, it might be library science, it might be history, it might be philosophy. and then spend what time you can on parapsychology, and when there is a window of opportunity, you jump into it like I did.
Thanks very much, Sam. Just a comment on your experience of hostile... Over here?
As loud as you can.
Just a comment, turn the speaker on. No, it's not. Okay. Comment on your experience with psychology colleagues being hostile when mine was invited to the lab.
Experiences of hostility
Your
from
talks?
psychologists when Warren was invited. Say more.
Yes.
I would like to make a comment about that.
Yes, the year was actually 1953, and I would say that the hostility is actually much less. Some of you know that I and several other members of our group actually made a presentation on parapsychology for the Society for Psychological Science, and we had absolutely no scoffing or critical comments from the audience, and that would have been inconceivable 20 years ago. In the meantime, I presented, I should put it this way, not that I'm bragging or anything, but every paper I've submitted to the American Psychological Association on parapsychology has been accepted by 4 different divisions. Well, because the papers were well crafted, they were within the framework of psychology, they were very tentatively presented, they were not dogmatic, they were not shrill, they were not claiming that this is the cutting edge of science. They were within the general framework of anomalous experiences in parapsychology. Of all of the books I've written, probably the most important is the co-edited book, Varieties of Anomalous Experience. That's made a very, very big impact in the field of psychology, now in its 2nd edition, as you know.
The comment that I wanted to make was that I think there have been some surveys looking at the attitudes of different academic disciplines towards parapsychology, and it's quite consistently been found that psychologists are the more hostile compared to, for example, physicists. And I think part of the reason for that is to do with demarcation issues, that psychologists are themselves vulnerable of being accused of being soft scientists. And so their parapsychology reminds psychologists of their weaknesses. And that is, I think, why parapsychologists have to be very careful how we present ourselves to psychologists.
Caroline was saying that parapsychology reminds psychologists of their weaknesses, and so there's kind of extra hostility on their part toward parapsychology.
I think that that's a very good way to put it, because psychologists often think that they know it all. They know the parameters of the field. And when something comes up saying, well, there might be a dimension of human experience and behavior that you don't know about, this threatens it, and means I'll have to learn something more to keep abreast. And I think that you put it very well. And, you know, I'm not one of these people that thinks, I don't use the word revolutionary to describe parapsychology. I see it within the broader framework of psychology. And I think, well, you know, sometimes frameworks have to be expanded and revised. But sometimes new research techniques, sometimes new worldviews have to come into the picture. But you can do all of this within a scientific setting. And frankly, I think that that's why I was able to get a nice representation of critics of the field into the book I co-edited by Harris Friedman, Debating Psychic Experiences. Nice plug for the book. I hope you all get a copy. But actually, I was on very good terms with all of the critics. Richard Wiseman, of course, and James Alcott, Ray Hyman, who's a close personal friend of mine, and Christopher French. Yes, they all contributed wonderful chapters. We had a very lively and civilized debate. Chris Carter went a little over the edge, but that's his nature. And so again, you know, I think that we all can learn something from each other.
Other?
I just want to underscore that. I had to introduce Stan for something at one point, and I read some of his bio, and I lost count of the number of associations of which he is a fellow. He has more credibility in more professional scientific associations than you can almost count. So however he's done it, it's been a remarkable achievement. A little like Bob Morris in the UK, I suppose. Just very cheerfully making his way among a broad variety of scientific disciplines and making lots of friends everywhere he goes. If you ever go to a meeting with Stan, it makes you a little dizzy because people all over the place want to come over and say hello to him because they consider him their close friend from way back sometime. And it's quite an interesting experience. Let's move on to Mario.
Well, what can I say after coming in after Stan? Well, one thing we have in common is that I arrived at Maimonides almost about the time that Stan was moving out. So my story, for what it's worth, I started out I came in from Greece. I was living in Greece as a high school student, high school, and with my parents. And at 18 plus one day, I went to the States for my undergraduate studies and graduate studies. And sometime fairly soon, I met a woman. And we were having a relationship, and she kind of was into all kinds of weird things, including parapsychology. And she managed to convince me that there's something to it, at least to convince me enough to talk about this weird place in Brooklyn called the Maimonides Division of Psychophysics and Parapsychology. And so just out of kind of curiosity, this is kind of like a field test, I went to see what this is all about. I was just beginning my undergraduate studies. And I was most surprised to find people there doing some very weird things, like studying dream telepathy, I was told. And I was saying, wait a minute, first of all, how do you study dreams? What, dream telepathy? And so, at any rate, I kind of hung around enough to get my curiosity peak. I kind of intrigued. And I soon found myself there as a student volunteer, cutting out from magazines and newspapers little photos to glue onto target sheets, which then became the binary, the Maimonides binary target system. So I spent a lot of very high level research at first with scissors and pieces of paper. And but progressively, I was getting more and more hooked to this field because there were it was amazing. This was like the 70s, the early 70s, mid 70s, and they were asking questions which I was always very curious about, the mind and the relationship with the world and reality and what is all this. And of course, it helped that there were all kinds of experimental things that were starting to happen in terms of the states of consciousness in the States at the time, which kind of was expanding the mind in different ways. And so I met a lot of people. I was mainly working with Charles Lonergan and Lawrence Tremmell, and then Keith Harari and a few others. And so at some point I started to get into the Ganzfeld as well with this, after cutting and pasting, I started actually seeing how sessions work and participating in them. So it was all very exciting, and then I had to, at some point, start graduate school. And when I started graduate school, I had a dilemma. I was in a normal research psychology program, normal, meaning nothing parapsychological about it. And my very first year there, I got into an argument with a very, very opinionated and very smart cognitive science professor, Piagetian, who thought I was crazy, basically, that there had been some mistake in the admissions procedure, and said there's this guy in my class that's talking about parapsychology and saying that we can act on things at a distance, maybe, and that we can have communication with others at a distance and so forth. And I don't know how he got in there. And at some point in one of the many heated debates that we had, she said, "Mr. Varvoglis, if I cut somebody's head off, can he still be there?" I said, "Well, that's a complex question. I'm not sure how to answer that because there are..." So I thought she was kind of wanting a true answer, and she stopped me and said, "Okay, we can't talk any further. We live in two different worlds." And then she wouldn't talk to me further, and she really tried to get me kicked out of the school, out of Adelphi University. So The next year, I mean, I survived that year. I managed to survive. The next year, I started approaching it very differently, the issue. And I started, basically what I did is I convinced Sonia to invite Chuck Honorton for a conference. That, I don't know how that happened, but there are paranormal, we've talked about influence, you know, mind-to-mind influence and so forth. So somehow I convinced her to invite Chuck Honorton. And she, maybe a year later, she was a little bit older and she had mellowed out or whatever, but at any rate, she did. She was intrigued. And then the third year, which was the graduation year, after that I had to go on to work on my thesis, she actually had me for her. She was departing from Adelphi University and going to another university. And it was a very, you know, teary thing after I don't know how many decades she was there. She asked me to give, at the ending party, the reception for her farewell party, to give a talk on parapsychology. So this was like a total turnaround in her home to give a talk. And then, when she left, David Palermo, who was a cognitive psychologist, a developmental psychologist at Penn State, was invited to replace her, and he became my thesis advisor. And I managed to do a thesis on parapsychology on micro-PK. Pretty complicated thesis. And David, though he wasn't at all convinced that all this is possible, he believed in academic freedom, and he defended my right to do a doctoral thesis in a psychology program, research psychology program, which I did at what had then become Psychophysical Research Labs. Charles Honorton had moved to Princeton, and he had invited just 2 individuals, me and Pat Barker there, and a few others that come from other areas. And so we started the Princeton Psychophysical Research Labs, which was kind of like the sister lab to the PAIR, Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research. So that's where I really started doing research in the field. First for my doctoral thesis, and then on the Gonsfeld and on other micro-PK work. So one thing that interested me at that time was integrating some of the things that we were learning through the Gonsfeld, which is to do with states of consciousness and the right mental climate and so forth, integrating that into micro-PK. So I started fumbling around with PK games, with software that could be game-like, and that would be coupled with random number generators. So one of these was, am I doing okay? I was, yeah. One of these was called PK Dancers, and it was literally, this was, you have to realize, in 1981, so this was very early computer. The Apple II had just come out, and but I had managed to do some pretty fancy work with Apple and with the Apple and with digitizing members of the Royal Ballet. No, I don't remember. Anyway, some dancers chopping their head off, maybe it was Sonia, and replacing with heads of people, myself first and our secretary, to see if we can create a situation in which the person who's interacting with a PK task, you know, random number generator task, it looks like they're trying to make this dancer dance, and this dancer would have their own head on it. So it was kind of, you know, like saying, imagine yourself, you know, that you become this great ballet dancer, and that you're dancing, and the movements of the dancer are dependent on your influence on this random number generator. So anyway, to cut a long story short, that got me on to, when I left, okay, another woman. That was another move. So John Palmer would say I'm field dependent, or is it something like that, because it seems that women may change my life every once in a while. One of the women that came to PRL as a visiting scientist was Christine Hardy, who was doing her doctoral research in Paris, and she had come for a 1 year. She had been invited by Chuck Honorton for 1 year to do some of her research in Princeton, at the Princeton PRL. And so we met, and and then at some point when her visa was up, she said, well, I have to go back to France. What do you want to do? And I said, well, France is kind of midway between Greece and the States. Sounds like a good place to kind of get closer to my origins. And also I wanted to stay with her. And so we decided to get married and come to Paris. And I ended up in Paris, and of course, contrary to the promises made, there was zero likelihood of doing any research in any recognized center or anything like that in France. So I left from one of the most conspicuous and visible and good laboratories in the world, PRL, in the States certainly, and I think in the world also, to a no man's land where for a couple of years I was trying to continue doing research out of my basement, basically. Developing these side tests and portable side tests that we can go out on the field with. And somehow or another, I was noticed by a Swiss research foundation named the Audier Foundation that asked me if I wanted to be financed by them, if I wanted to say, what do you think? And they did help me start, so I started doing some research with them, but fairly quickly it kind of was turned around because they saw potential for general public educational supports and asked me to create a CD-ROM. At the time, CD-ROMs were coming into vogue. It didn't last too long. And I created, thanks to help from the Bial Foundation, I created a CD-ROM called Psy Explorer, which was a general public kind of support, educational and self-testing support, which received pretty good reviews. And that made me visible in France, and soon after I was invited to take on the presidency of the Institut Métapsychique International, a foundation that's kind of the equivalent of the SPR. It's the French SPR. And has a 100-year history, not quite as long, but still. And I've been the president since 1997, 1998 of that institute. All this didn't help, of course, for my making a living. In fact, it's been a heavy impact on my ability to earn money, because all this is, of course, volunteer in being at the Institut Métapsychique since 1998. So I had to pursue a parallel path, and this gets back to what Stan was saying, that don't put all your eggs in the basket of parapsychology. So I pursued a parallel path, which was creativity and innovation, organizational creativity and innovation. And so that's what's allowing me to still continue to do something in the field. So today, what the Institut Métapsychique, the big focus of it is educational. We've been trying to become present again because it had a low period at the time that I arrived. It had been very low, and then progressively we managed to build it up again into an entity that exists and is visible. And so we have an educational role with conferences and seminars and so forth, and organizing different meetings of the PA, including meetings, and also some research, thanks to the Bial Foundation, essentially. We have been able to start getting involved in research again, and we're in the process of doing this and have been joined from. Basically, we're trying to drain anyone who's anyone in France and who's interested in parapsychology. We try to make sure that they're in some way or another, we're in a collaborative relationship, or that they're part of the Institut Métapsychique board. So the only way we can survive there is through some kind of network of individuals that are interested in this field seriously and professionally. And that's I identify with the Institute for now. I'm trying to last until 2019, which is when it's the 100th anniversary, and then I can say I withdraw with a clear spirit. But so that's my story.
Reactions or questions?
Well, I have one. Caroline asked such an interesting question, I really have to follow up with a brief anecdote. In analogous development from my field of learning disabilities, when I was at Kent State University directing the Developmental Child Study Center, occasionally a mother would bring in an autistic child and would be guilt-ridden because she thought that she was a poor mother. And I was saying, that's nonsense. Your kid's brain is just wired differently than other kids. Now, those are in the days when Bruno Bettelheim, who very few of you have heard of, was a psychoanalyst and the authority on autism, wrote a book called The Empty Fortress, one of the most harmful books ever written about children, and claiming that autism was the result of poor mothering. And so I relieved a lot of parents from guilt by saying, no, the brain is simply wired differently, was the best way I can put it. Now, of course, Bernard Rumland came along and started a revolution in our thought about autism, and so thank heavens I was on the right side of history. But all of the experts in autism had to relearn what they had been practicing for years and accommodate a new paradigm, and it was difficult for them, and some of them never gave up. They clung on to that psychoanalytic dogma, ruining other mothers and fathers and their relationships with their kids until they retired. So it's not only in parapsychology. There are other fields too where a new paradigm comes in and the old guard has something new to learn, and many of them are very resistant.
I have also a question to Mario. I'm wondering, or could you give some reflection or factors why the French academic establishment seems so against parapsychological research? Of course, there are eminent exceptions, but given especially history of EMI.
Well, I think that it's a confluence, it's a convergence of several factors. One of them is the strong, I mean, it's cultural and contextual and historical, and I think part of it is the French Revolution in a way, but Renaud would probably have to correct me on this because he's really more of an expert than me about France. But it's basically, I think that there are several factors. One is the absolute, very strong protest and rebellion against church, against the Catholic Church that occurred at some point in France's recent history, and authority in general. And for different reasons, parapsychology means the paranormal, means miracles and you know, divine and all that. So it has been identified with this irrational, dark past, which is, even though in a way we're trying to make it, to bring it down to earth in a sense. I mean, it's totally absurd, but in a way, I mean, this is not just in France, but in France it's particularly extreme because of this rebellion that occurred not only against the emperors and the kings of France, but also against all forms of authority. Another is that in the post-World War II, there was the right and the left, as everywhere, and post-World War II, there was a big increase in left-dominated university posts, because basically there was the collaborators with the invaders, with the Nazis, and they were all, of course, disgraced, and there was a big raise in the status of the left, which had resisted. And that favored also the kind of I won't say a takeover, but a very strong presence of the left. And for the left, parapsychology is also bad news, because somehow it's like, for historical reasons that are a bit complicated, is somehow identified with esoteric and unclear, and it's not the people and down here and down to earth and so forth. There's that, and there are many other reasons, including just, I think, the fact that France prides itself in its rationalistic tradition. It's definitely coming from the Cartesian, more so than Descartes, more Cartesian than Descartes, and they didn't quite, the empiricist tradition is more present, I think, in Anglo-Saxon and maybe in German, I'm not sure, but I think it's more present in different traditions than in France, and so somehow psi doesn't make sense, therefore it doesn't exist. The data must be wrong somewhere. We already know how the world works. There are strong frameworks. So I think that all kinds of things. And also that we don't have a tradition of nice donors. That we don't have the same tradition of big money coming in and leaving big gifts. And of course, we also haven't pursued that as much as we should pursue it. So that's also been the problem.
Jim, we're waiting to hear your story.
Okay. I want to say I do appreciate all of you being here because we're competing with, to my mind, the most interesting panel of the conference. So I'm delighted that you're willing to be here.
You have something to say? She has a question.
Is there a question?
Yeah.
What I wanted to know is, when you first arrived in Paris, did you have any knowledge of the French language? Or is it something you developed? Because later you became the president of INI. So you, and I know by experience that you speak now French fluently, and nobody can distinguish you from a French, and when you speak American, nobody can distinguish you from an American. So it's an inclination towards languages. Is it another one of your talents? Did you have knowledge of French? It's because of discussing with Christine.
She would make suggestions to me at night while I was sleeping. She would talk in my sleep. It's called hypnopedia or something like that. No, basically, I was kind of forced fit into a situation. It's true that I changed countries 3 times. When I was 6 years old, I had to go to Greece, and I was dumped into a Greek school at 6 years old in 1960. So that was a very difficult time. Then I went back to the States, and I came to France. So basically, yeah, I had to pick up languages. But I don't know how I did it, but apparently I'm told that I was giving conferences in French 1 year after I arrived. Small conferences, small workshops. And I was saying, but I didn't speak French. How was I doing that? I have no recollection, but others attest to the fact that they understood some of what I was saying.
It's one of your talents.
A bit about my story. I'll start with my childhood. I grew up with parents who were open and interested in these things, and a mother who had apparent psychic experiences. And the one that stands out to me is there was a period in which I think I was about 7, and the family was in bad shape. My dad had been out of work for a while. He had no prospects. My parents didn't know what they were going to do, and my mother sort of collapsed in anxious fatigue one day into a chair and had a vision. And in the vision, a man who she said looked like Santa Claus dressed in a business suit. Right. Stood there and said, don't worry, he said, you're going to be moving to a town that's 2 towns divided by a river with no water. And she told my dad that, and I remember him telling me that, and my sister that, which made absolutely no sense. I mean, I was 7, so it certainly made no sense to me, but it made no sense to anyone. It was this odd riddle, but my mother found it very comforting, and I learned later that she had these visions periodically, and they tended to tell her things that were helpful. So I don't know, she took some comfort from that, and then as some time went on and my dad did get a job, and after we moved to this town in northern New Mexico, all of this came back to her because it was Las Vegas, New Mexico with an odd history. And it's actually, at that time, it was two separate municipalities, even though it was a town of only 13,000 people. It had started out as the northernmost point on the Santa Fe Trail and was an Hispanic town, really part of the Mexican Empire. And then when the railroad came through, an Anglo town developed beside it. The Anglos and the Chicanos were not happy with one another, and they kept separate municipalities for years. And what divided the two little towns was the Guaymas River, which never has water in it. And so they did, in fact, move to a town that was two towns divided by a river with no water. And this is the kind of thing that I could tell you a half dozen similar stories from her. So these things intrigued me. At the same time, I think there was enough dysfunction in my family that, like a lot of people, I've made a career out of trying to solve the problems that my family gave me. And I think two of the most interesting problems they gave me were psychopathology and psychic experiences. And I've kept a hand in both fields. In high school, I also started having out-of-body experiences and found myself waking up from a nap, floating at the ceiling and looking down and seeing things, seeing my body lying beneath me. And I had a friend who was more into occult things than I was, and I mentioned this to him, and he said, "Oh, well, that's astral projection." And he gave me a book by Sylvan Muldoon. I think Sylvan Muldoon is still the creepiest name I've ever heard in my life. And I did read this kind of creepy book about spirit travel, which some of you may love Sylvan, and I don't mean to insult him, I don't know anything about him, but this book hit me at an impressionable time, and I thought it was kind of scary nonsense. And but he was describing my experiences. That was intriguing. And at the same time, my mother was the librarian in town, and she would bring home books from J.B. Ryan, who was writing, I remember she brought home The Reach of the Mind. And I read that with a lot of interest, and being very naive, like Stan said, I wrote Ryan a letter and said, "I'm a bright high school student in Las Vegas, New Mexico. Would you like me to come study with you?" And I got this very nice letter back. We exchanged a couple of letters. I was too naive to know that this was ridiculous. But he was very gracious and wrote back and said, you know, if you can get yourself to Duke, you can come see me. So I took that as more encouraging than it probably was intended to be. And did get myself to Duke. I like to say that I was sent to college by Sputnik because in the 50s, Sputnik scared the U.S. Congress to death, and so they passed the National Defense Education Act, which dumped lots of money into good schools for bright kids to come across the country to study and become engineers and scientists and defeat the Soviet Union in science. And I got one of those. Duke had a lot of money. I got a wonderful scholarship, went to Duke, and of course with the plan to meet J.B. And I did. I went and met J.B. Ryan and also met a remarkable group of friends, which I'm sure changed the course of my life. The friends more than J.B. I'm 21, and there's Bob Morris and Rick Stanford and J.B. and Louisa. And J.B. decided that we were his heirs, and he would tell us that in different ways. And also Chuck. Chuck isn't in the picture, but Chuck was in that little group at that time. And a little bit later, John Palmer joined the group, and Ed Kelly joined the group. B.K. Contamani joined the group. And that little cluster of people became probably my best friends for a few years. And we partied together and drank together and carried out ESP experiments together and talked together. Oftentimes we'd sometimes talk through the night. We would talk and realize the birds were singing outside and the sun had come up and we were still talking. And Bob was still taking notes. And Rex was still thinking real hard. And Chuck was still trying to make everyone laugh by saying outrageous things. So it was a remarkable group of people, and all our wives, and we just had a huge amount of fun together. There were a lot of parties at Bob Morris's house where people would gather, and Bob would dance the boogaloo, and all of a sudden John Palmer would be on the floor because Rex would have grabbed him from behind and he was doing a healing, and he would be saying, "Heal this man." Rex had a routine of a West Texas evangelist, and he would do, "Jesus, heal this man," and he would be pounding poor John Palmer on the floor, and John was writhing around, and everyone would gather around and have Rex would teach us how to do a West Texas evangelical service, impromptu. And there's the same three at the same age during that same period, so we thought we were pretty sharp. And I'd say, mention Dave Rogers became sort of part of that same group. Well, we all had a falling out with Ryan. Ryan was actually an inspiring figure scientifically. He was very brave. He was very rigorous. He had enormous integrity, and he was really, really a difficult person to work for. He was very controlling. He was very authoritarian. This was the early 60s. It was not an authoritarian age. We were not people who wanted to be subject to anyone's authority. And it was just, Ryan is dead, can't defend himself. I'm not going to talk about him. But we all in our different ways certainly decided that he was impossible to work for. He wasn't impossible to work with. He was certainly a nice teacher, a very inspiring figure, but not someone you wanted to have authority over you. So in different ways we all went different directions, and I wasn't so convinced about parapsychology really as Bob and Chuck and Rex especially were at that point. And I went off to Ohio State to study clinical psychology, and although I kept my hand in parapsychology and did some studies, some ESP studies at Ohio State, kind of sneaking around. Although I didn't sneak too much, I debated a history of psych professor, and I thought I did pretty well, and my friends thought I did really well. I certainly knew a lot of more facts than he did. And it drew a huge house, drew a huge audience. Ryan came to town at one point, and I sponsored him in a talk in town, kind of like Stan did. And I also got to be, before there was this falling out, I got to be, to do some field work for JB. There was a folk veterinarian near Columbus who some people wrote to Ryan about, saying, "You really ought to study this man. He does these amazing things with animals." And the most amazing thing was that he stops bleeding. And he was, like I say, he was a folk veterinarian. His name was Willie Clark. He went back to a time before there were really veterinarians in the area, and he would stop bleeding in animals and in people, although his main skill was doing it in animals. And I witnessed this. I saw him cut a big hole in a horse's jugular vein, took a film of this, blood was spurting out, a little fountain on a very snowy day in Ohio, and this gore was collecting on the snow. And we had a little experimental routine worked up, and I told him I was going to tell him using a stopwatch when to stop the bleeding. He went up and touched it, and the bleeding stopped. And, you could go up and pull the skin back and look both ways in this huge vein, and it was dry, completely dry from the moment he touched it. And I collected a bunch of stories about Willie, and including from a physician who had seen him stop bleeding from a man who was hemorrhaging massively after falling down an elevator shaft. So anyway, I collected these interesting anomalous stories, and that kind of got me started with an interest in fieldwork, although I didn't follow up a huge amount with that. During this period, a number of us would come back for the summers and for summer study with Ryan and summer work with Ryan during graduate school. And Rex and Bob finished up a year before I did and actually went to work for Ryan, and then there was this huge falling out. And I was in San Francisco at the time doing a clinical internship, and I'd already decided actually never to join Ryan, so I thought it was a great risk for them to take on, and it turns out it was as impossible as I was afraid it would be. But it did inculcate us all with a number of ideas about how to do rigorous research. Ryan really was a stickler about that, and I think we all developed some very strict and good habits. One little story about Ryan that illustrates a softer side of how difficult he was. During one of these summers, we were gathered together in this sort of ESP testing party atmosphere that we had going for a while. And Chuck had decided that we needed to do a drawing test based on some of the British work. And my wife did especially well on this, and so Chuck said, what we need is a confirmatory series, so we did another one focusing on her, and she did very well again. And Chuck took these results into Ryan the next day, and Ryan just put him down entirely and said, I won't have this in my laboratory. This is a throwback. These are old British methods. We don't do it that way. We use cards where you can count really precisely, and so forth. So he had it just shows how arbitrary and authoritarian he was. I'll just skip ahead a little bit. There was a chapter after that where I came to teach at the University of North Carolina after I graduated. And I carried on not in parapsychology, but in research on family communication and in person perception. And I was doing well, I was publishing well, and in self-disclosure, sort of those areas. At the same time, I was teaching a parapsychology course with Dave Rogers, who was also on the faculty there. And we weren't keeping our parapsychological side hidden, we just weren't doing it. I was doing this mainstream work. And then we made the mistake of sponsoring a conference at UNC in which, on parapsychology, and Jay Levy came and presented these astonishing results of psychic rodents. And the results were so striking that they got a number of people on our faculty really intrigued. And then it broke that Jay was cheating and had been uncovered by his colleagues in a wonderful story how they did it. And anyway, I had to immediately take this around to everybody in my department and say, look, don't get excited about Jay Levy, he's a fraud. And we figured that out over at the FRNM. Well, this actually, unfortunately, was right before my tenure decision was coming up. And this became a very big deal for a couple of people. And I'll say a long story very short. I went through a very brutal tenure period, which I lost. And one person said that she stood up apparently in a very emotional meeting where this was being discussed and said that she would be dead before I stayed. And another guy who had equally strong feelings said that I was an international humiliation, as if UNC was international anything, but he thought if it was, then I was the humiliation of the department. So since tenure is a blackball system, it didn't matter how many people loved me, which was almost everybody. I left there and had to consider then, I was very bruised and battered at that point and had to consider what to do. But I certainly learned how fierce the hostility to parapsychology is. I thought I knew that, but it's another thing to experience it firsthand. It's like the difference between knowing that there's violence and being beaten up in an alley. I was beaten up in an alley. It was rough. Well, from there, I had the good fortune of, I could have gone to a couple of other universities, but I actually was battered enough that I decided I didn't have it in me. I was always a good clinician. It was a good option for me. I went into private practice. Our kids were in school in the area. I had FRNM in the nearby. Good relationship with Richard Broughton and other people there. Richard was running a very good show. I decided I'll be a clinician, make a good living, keep up research at FRNM, and do the part of research that I actually care most about anyway, which is parapsychology, even though I've been hiding that fact. And entered into a period that was about twice as happy as I had been when I was trying to fit in at the university. And I've been twice as happy ever since. So I have no regrets about that. I need to wrap up, and I want to wrap up with a dream, because the last part of my parapsychological life has been theory building, and the theory came to me in a dream. And here's the dream. This happened a number of years ago. I was standing in a stream on a rock, and I was looking around to try to figure out which next rock to jump to. So I jumped to the next rock, then I looked around for the next rock to jump to, and I jumped to the next rock, and I was looking again. And then I started to wake up at that point, and as I'm waking up, I don't know if you have this, I use my dreams a lot, with myself and with my clients also. As I'm waking up, I realize, oh, this is what ESP is for. ESP is for getting to the next thought. And that made perfect sense to me. Although it's a dream kind of thought, and it doesn't seem all that sensible when you get a little bit more awake, but it seemed terribly sensible at that moment. And the next thing I thought was, I'm going to have to tell Richard. And then I woke on up and I reflected on all this. And this was at a time when Richard Broughton was actually leaving Durham, and I never got to tell him that until last night, or the night before last. I told him this dream. So I said, you may not like my theory, but you're to blame. And the reason Richard is to blame is that in his presidential address to the PA a long time ago, he laid down this challenge. He said, if you want to know how something works, first figure out what it's for. And that stuck with me all those years. And it's been a kind of kernel of a question for me. So I got an idea about what ESP may be for.
I think in psychology and psychiatry today is blocking the access to the patient's inner world, and it also creates pain for them, I think. It creates a specific pain, and especially concerning patients with special gifts or conditions that are outside of all ways of thinking. And there's a great, the pain and sacrifice and the fears that these patients carry is very dramatic. It's a drama. It was mentioned before in the conferences. This is a real clinical drama also. And I thank you for also illustrating some of your dramas.
Yeah, we need to do a lot of, we could have much of a conference devoted to the questions you just raised. They're very important. One of the benefits I received after deciding to leave academics was, and going into clinical work, I realized one day, not only was I surprisingly happy, but my main motive for being a psychologist to begin with was, I grew up in a family that was very silent and very inscrutable and often distant physically. And So I never knew what was going on inside people. I was always intrigued with that. And I think I really I have a deep yearning to know how people tick and how people work. And that's been the dominant issue probably for me that's guided the guiding question, how do people work? And I realized, talking with a patient one day, that people are coming in every day, hour after hour, telling me the most important things about life and paying me for it. And I thought, my goodness, what a racket. I'm learning much faster than if I were doing studies, although I was still doing studies. But what wonderful access to the deepest secrets about human nature. And of course, since people know that I'm into parapsychology, I've had a lot of access. I've had a lot of people bringing wonderful stories in and experiences, and getting to work with pretty psychic people as well as pretty crazy people. Just a whole gamut of people who think of themselves in paranormal ways. And I could tell you lots of stories, but I really don't want to hold you beyond this. But that's been an incredible education in itself. And it's something the PA is trying to figure out how to address a little better, because we get lots and lots of inquiries from suffering people. And we don't respond to them adequately at all. Of course, we're not a service organization. We're not supposed to do that, but somehow we should be doing a little more than we are. We're trying to think hard about that.
Well, one question. In your talk, you argued that psi is normal, which I totally agree. By the way, in Rosemary Pilkington's book, the title of my presentation is exactly what you say. I say psi is normal. That's what I'm saying. Now, my question is, this is in contrast to, I think, to G.B. Ryan's approach, because, I have a different approach. I say psi is normal, but it's not a signal. But and this is in contrast with G.B. Ryan's approach, and it has completely different properties. Now, did you have this idea after your Ryan period, or did you ever communicate this with Ryan? Because I would be interested what Ryan, he has of course a lot of experience, so what he would have said to this kind of viewing at things, because this is a kind of new paradigm.
I've wondered that myself. No, I thought of these things long after Ryan was dead. And so I never had any chance to talk to him about that. I wonder, he was, he was very hungry to find out a way to understand psi. At the same time, he was very hard-headed and rigid. And it's an interesting question how he would have reacted to a different paradigm. I know he never really got his head around what Helmut was doing. He tried and he respected it, but I'm pretty sure he never really understood it. He never understood how Helmut understood things. So he had his limitations.
Maybe the closest he came to that was his interest in Tallis and Wiesner's concepts. The Shin, the idea that psi is normal in its analogy to internal psychokinesis and internal ESP. And in that sense, yes, I believe he was aware of that kind of model and interested of the endosomatic as opposed to exosomatic expression of the mind-matter kind of.
Well, yes.
It's not the same.
Yes.
I know it's not the same model, but it's
it's
one approach for normalizing psi, to say that volition is an internal manifestation of what we normally think of as, what we think externally as psychokinesis.
Well, the crucial point in this view is, probably Dean Rating would support this, that entanglement is a basic structure of nature. And if we are able to perceive entanglement, then this means we do this all the time, and we do it as you described it, but only in certain situations it comes up as a kind of anomaly. But there is a crucial consequence of this way of looking at it, because we have to do quite different experiments. And the underlying idea when I asked the question was, because in the Runyon approach you have a complete separation between the target and the subject, and this separation, so to say, is unnatural. In natural situations you are immersed, or you are embodied in your surrounding, and in this embodiment you are able to use the entanglement, because entanglement is just another aspect of embodiment. So you see, this is an idea which is also in cognitive science and also in computer science even very important. But it has different consequences for experimentation. So we should not keep out all the causal links with our environment, because they are also necessary to produce this entanglement. That was the underlying idea, and I would have known whether G.B. Ryan would be against this idea, or whether he could accept it.
You know, over time he did adapt himself to new things to some extent, and of course he got older and then got more rigid as an old man, with an old man's brain. I think he was so spooked by association. It reminds me really of the founder of the PF.
Eileen Garrett?
Yeah, I'm sorry. Of his reaction to Eileen Garrett. He was so afraid of being linked with anyone that might turn out to be seen as fraudulent or criticized, that he kept a very antiseptic environment. And even though he was very impressed with Eileen Garrett on a personal level and got some wonderful results with her in their kind of informal testing, he never wanted to publish it, he never wanted to admit it, he never wanted to confess it. So he didn't like that naturalistic setting. I think he found it too dangerous. And this was based on, I saw him go through an enormous, I mean, if I got beaten in an alley, he was beaten in many alleys. I mean, he really went through an enormous amount of conflict and controversy and abuse, and took it. But it left him kind of with PTSD. It left him very spooked about anything that wasn't in methods that weren't really antiseptic. And whether he could have gotten over that if he'd had more years, I have no idea.
I had to deal with her because she was a spiritistic, whatever, okay. And so I suppose this brought, he better has a skill to be in a open-minded, what Garth Murphy also said, that he had a skill to keep, so to say, the system open between crystallizing and not too fluid, of course. Yes, and this is, I suppose, a skill which we have always to learn until the end of our life, whatever that comes.
I always thought it's not a last word comment, but there's a term in psychology called tolerance of ambiguity. And I always thought that parapsychologists must have a very high tolerance of ambiguity, especially in this organization, because we're always dealing with, we're right on the edge between the skeptics and the believers and all this. And but apparently you can have high tolerance of ambiguity in certain things and not in others. So this is about J.B. Ryan. He can be very crystallized and at the same time have a high So anyway, yes, thank you.
And thank you all very much.